She wondered if her success came from genuine talent, or if it was simply because America needed a model of a successful black person to please public opinion. The sharp question echoed, causing the entire studio to fall silent. Richard Hall waited, believing he had cornered Oprah, but she only smiled, her gaze calm. She knew she was about to turn this interview into a moment no one would ever forget. In the vast space of the studio, the spotlight shone down on the chair where Oprah Winfrey sat. She wore an elegant outfit, her face maintaining its usual composed expression. In front of her sat one of America's most famous journalists, Richard Hall, known for his sharp interview style, sometimes bordering on harsh. This interview was broadcast live on national television, drawing millions of viewers. With Oprah's fame and influence, it was considered one of the biggest television events of the year. But no one could have predicted that what seemed like a routine conversation would turn into a tense confrontation. Richard Hall looked at Oprah with a knowing smile. He crossed his arms, leaned forward, preparing for his questions. From the outset, he exuded complete confidence, as if he were in full control of the situation. Ms. Winfrey, you are one of the most influential women in America. From a poor girl to one of the greatest media icons, an undeniably inspiring story. But, he paused, emphasizing the word but, creating a silence that made the audience hold their breath. Have you ever thought that your success is largely due to timing? That if it weren't for America's push for diversity, you might not have achieved what you have today? The atmosphere in the room seemed to freeze. Some audience members raised their eyebrows, others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard Hall's first question carried an underlying provocative tone, but Oprah remained unfazed. She sat upright, her hands gently resting on her thighs, her gaze sharp but devoid of anger. Thoughts raced through her mind. This wasn't the first time she'd been put in this position. She had heard many doubts, many prejudices, but she had never let them shake her belief in herself. Already trying to attack me from the start? Oprah thought to herself. She gave a light smile. She knew exactly what she had to do. She took a deep breath, ready for her answer. An answer no one could have expected. Oprah still sat there, holding her gentle smile, her eyes calm as if nothing could touch her psyche. But in the atmosphere of the studio, an invisible tension was slowly rising. The bright lights, the cameras pointing at the two of them, and the hundreds of viewers intently watching every word, every expression. Richard Hall knew this was the perfect moment to push the interview further. This man was no novice in the media industry. He was one of the most seasoned reporters, having exposed and challenged many powerful figures. He didn't ask questions to hear answers, but to set a trap, to test and shake the person across from him. He cleared his throat, placed his pen down on the table, and his sharp eyes scanned the audience before landing on Oprah's face. Ms. Winfrey, I'm sure you understand that society is always looking for role models to praise. He spoke slowly, emphasizing each word, creating the feeling that he was guiding the listener into a maze he had prepared. In history, there have been times when people have sought to create an inspiring story to prove something. And sometimes that story doesn't actually stem from an individual's exceptional ability or talent, but from society's need. He paused, watching Oprah's reaction. She said nothing, only tilted her head slightly, her eyes still calm. But the atmosphere in the studio had shifted. People in the audience began to sense the underlying sarcasm in Richard's words. Some viewers furrowed their brows, and a few exchanged uncomfortable glances. Richard noticed this, but he didn't care. He had chosen this path, and he would see it through. I wonder, Richard continued, his voice lowering with calculated intent, whether your success was inevitable. Or was it the result of a moment in time when America needed a symbol to prove that the American dream still exists, that anyone can rise, that people of color can succeed just as brilliantly as anyone else? A silence blanketed the room. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Everyone understood what Richard was implying. He was not just questioning Oprah's success. He was diminishing it, turning it into a product of the times, a political trend rather than true talent and hard work. He looked at Oprah with a scrutinizing gaze, waiting for her to fall into the trap he had set. If she got angry, it would be a sign of weakness. If she avoided it, he would press harder. Richard sat up straight, arms crossed, appearing relaxed. Let's see what she does. But Oprah didn't flinch. She looked straight into Richard's eyes, her expression not filled with anger nor discomfort. Instead, it contained something few could maintain in such a confrontation: understanding. Oprah had heard this question before, not just once, but countless times. She remembered her early days in the media, when people said she would never make it as a TV host because audiences wouldn't accept a black woman on national airwaves. She remembered the press conferences where white men in expensive suits looked at her with suspicion, as if she didn't belong in their world. She remembered every door that had slammed in her face, every rejection, every moment she wondered if she was chasing an impossible dream. But she didn't stop, and today, as she sat here before Richard Hall, before millions of viewers, she knew she didn't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. She took a deep breath, offering a gentle smile. Mr. Hall, I won't deny that society is always in search of symbols, but if all it took was a black person sitting in my position to calm public opinion, then we would have had hundreds before me, right? Her words echoed softly but sharply, like a knife. Richard raised an eyebrow, not expecting her to counterattack so immediately. Oprah continued, her voice steady, strong. I'm not the first to try. I'm not the first to want change. Before me, there were hundreds, thousands of black women who fought for a place, for an opportunity, but they didn't get it. And the reason wasn't because they weren't talented enough, but because they weren't given the chance to be seen. I'm not a product of the times. I am a product of effort, persistence, and dreams that never got extinguished. A round of applause erupted from the audience, even though the show was still ongoing. Richard shifted slightly in his seat, realizing that he had misjudged Oprah. But he wasn't done. I don't deny that you've worked hard, Ms. Winfrey, Richard said, trying to regain control. But I still want to ask, can you say with certainty that the media didn't favor you more than others? Without the strong support from the movement, could you be sitting here today? Oprah smiled. She knew this was a battle of wits, and she was still in control. She leaned slightly forward, looking directly into Richard's eyes, her voice low but clear. The media can make someone famous, but it can't make someone successfully endure. Without real talent, I wouldn't have been able to sit here for over 40 years. The studio went silent for a moment. Then another round of applause erupted, louder and stronger. Richard Hall said nothing. In that moment, he realized he was facing a woman who couldn't be defeated by words alone. The atmosphere in the studio became thick. Richard Hall's question still hung in the air, a challenge filled with sarcasm. Do you really think you've helped the black community, or are you just enriching yourself? The entire studio seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Oprah's response. Some in the audience began exchanging glances. Others leaned forward, as if afraid they might miss an important moment if they blinked. But Oprah did not respond immediately. She took a deep breath, relaxed her shoulders, and smiled faintly. Not a forced smile, not a sarcastic smile, but one of someone who was used to questions like this. A smile from someone who had heard too many doubts, too many jabs, too many denials of her worth. She didn't show anger. She didn't frown. She didn't scowl. She didn't immediately defend herself like someone backed into a corner. Instead, she chose a far more effective method. She remained silent. Oprah's silence was not weak. It was not awkward or hesitant. It was a deliberate silence. Her eyes scanned the studio as if looking directly at each audience member, each person watching the interview on screen. And in that moment, Oprah was not just responding to Richard Hall, she was speaking to an entire generation, to all those who had been put in the same position as her, those who had been doubted, belittled, and questioned about their worth. People began to realize what was happening. They began to feel the chill of the very question Richard Hall had just asked. By remaining silent, Oprah allowed that question to expose its own insult. For the first time since the interview began, Richard appeared a bit flustered. He hadn't anticipated that Oprah would not respond immediately. He was expecting a rebuttal, an outburst, a justification, but there was nothing. The entire studio was completely silent, a chilling silence. Richard blinked, looked around for a moment, then shifted slightly in his seat. He didn't want to appear uncomfortable, but it was clear that the situation was not going according to the script he had in mind. One of the most dangerous things in a debate is when your opponent does not react as you anticipated, and Oprah was doing exactly that. His confidence wavered. After a few seconds of silence, Oprah took a deep breath and slowly nodded. An interesting question. Her voice carried no irritation, no mockery. It was entirely calm, but it had an undeniable power. I understand why you're asking, Mr. Hall, and I also understand why others might have the same thought. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze still fixed on Richard. But I want to ask you something. If a rich, powerful white man establishes a company and earns billions of dollars, would anyone question whether he is actually helping his community? A collective "oh" rippled through the crowd. Some people in the audience nodded slightly, as if realizing something important. Richard Hall was momentarily stunned. He hadn't expected this answer. But Oprah didn't stop there. Why, when a person of color succeeds, are we asked if we're helping our community? Why must our success be tied to an obligation to save others? Why can't we just be individuals who have worked hard and achieved something, just like anyone else? A round of applause broke out. Richard frowned. He realized he had stepped into a conversation he couldn't fully control. I don't deny that I have a responsibility to my community, Oprah continued, her voice stronger now, and I am proud that I have been able to help thousands of people, from providing scholarships and building schools to creating platforms to uplift others. But I want people to understand one thing. My success is not just about me. It's about everyone who has ever been told they couldn't. Those who were doubted, who were pushed aside simply because of where they came from. I did not succeed alone. I stand on the shoulders of those who paved the way for me to be here today. The audience applauded again, this time louder. Richard Hall tried to keep his composure, but he knew in that moment he had lost. In some way, Richard Hall's provocative question had become an opportunity for Oprah to affirm her worth, not just to herself, but to everyone watching. He had expected a confrontation, but instead, he had created a stage for Oprah to deliver a message more powerful than ever. And the audience was now on her side. Richard Hall took a breath, preparing for the next question. But now, something had changed. He no longer controlled the conversation. As for Oprah, she knew she had just turned an attack into a historic moment, and she was ready for any question that came next. Richard Hall sat upright, his gaze still holding a challenge, but his hands unconsciously clenched on the table. His question, though meant as an attack, had been turned by Oprah into an opportunity to assert her own worth. And now, she continued to hold the lead. She glanced towards the audience, her eyes distant for a moment. In that instant, she was no longer just sitting here, under the stage lights and the television cameras. She had returned to the past. In Oprah's mind, old memories began to resurface as clearly as if they had happened just yesterday. A small, dilapidated house in Mississippi, where she lived with her grandmother. The old wooden walls, the cracked dirt floor. In the summer, the stifling heat made each breath feel heavy. In the winter, the bone-chilling cold seeped into every corner of the house. Back then, she didn't have nice clothes. Oprah clearly remembered the feeling of wearing dresses made from repurposed potato sacks. The rough fabric, the clumsy stitches, all were proof of the poverty she had faced since childhood. The other children would look at her with mocking eyes, laughing. "That girl is wearing poor people's clothes. Who do you think you are, Oprah? You'll always be just a country girl." She remembered their mocking looks. She remembered the pain of being belittled, of being seen as worthless. But Oprah also remembered something else, her grandmother. Despite their poverty, Oprah's grandmother always emphasized one thing. "You have value, Oprah. Don't let anyone tell you you can't do something. You have to learn, you have to read, you have to believe in yourself. One day, you'll leave here, and you'll show the world what you can do." Those words were engraved in Oprah's mind. Every day she read relentlessly. She practiced speaking in front of a mirror, imagining herself standing on a grand stage. While the other children played, she buried herself in books. When others told her she had no future, she was determined to prove them wrong. At 17, Oprah won a statewide speech contest, earning a scholarship to attend college. That was the first turning point that helped her break free from the cycle of poverty. But even as she stepped onto the college campus, she still faced challenges. When Oprah began working in media, she was confronted with a harsh reality. There was no place for Black people in the industry. She remembered applying for jobs and being rejected immediately just because of the color of her skin. She remembered the interviews where people looked at her with suspicion, as if they couldn't believe a Black woman could be on television. She remembered the first time she was hired at a local television station. At that moment, she thought she had finally found her opportunity. But that dream was quickly crushed when she was asked to change her voice to sound less Black. "Our audience isn't used to this kind of voice. Can you make it sound more proper?" At that moment, Oprah felt humiliated, but she didn't back down. She kept working, kept learning, and kept proving herself. And then, every door that slammed shut in front of her, every skeptical gaze, every mocking word, all became fuel for her to rise above. She didn't just want success, she wanted to change the system. Oprah took a deep breath and returned to the present. She looked directly at Richard Hall. "Mr. Hall, I've heard questions like this my entire life. When I was young, people said I would never escape poverty. When I started my career, people said I would never make it on television. And when I succeeded, people said I was just a product of the times." She paused, letting her words sink into the air. "But I'm going to say this, and I want everyone to listen closely." Oprah looked directly at the camera, as if she were speaking to millions of people watching this show worldwide. "Success has no color. It only comes to those who never stop striving and dare to dream big." As soon as Oprah finished, the entire auditorium erupted into loud applause. Some people even stood up, showing their admiration for her. Richard Hall blinked, once again pushed into a defensive position. He had expected a debate, but instead, Oprah had turned this moment into a powerful, inspiring speech. He cleared his throat, trying to mask his discomfort. But Oprah knew that she had taken control of this conversation, and she was ready for whatever challenge came next. The applause hadn't quite died down when Richard Hall shifted slightly in his seat. He cleared his throat, as if wanting to interrupt the atmosphere that had clearly turned in Oprah's favor. Though he maintained a calm exterior, he knew exactly what was happening inside. He was losing control. This was no longer the interview he was leading. Oprah had turned it into her own stage, where she not only defended herself, but also won the audience's absolute support. But Richard Hall was not one to accept defeat easily. He knew that if he let Oprah continue to control the situation, his career as a journalist would be forever tied to the image of a man defeated live on television. He wouldn't let that happen. In a desperate attempt to regain control, he leaned slightly forward, his eyes sharp with determination, and asked, "Do you really think you've helped the black community, or are you just making yourself richer?" This time, his voice wasn't as certain as before. For a brief moment, Richard Hall realized he had made a mistake. Not because the question was too sharp, but because it was too predictable. It was the last question that skeptics always use when they have no other argument. A successful black woman with global influence who had worked tirelessly to rise from poverty, yet still faced the question of whether her success meant anything other than making herself rich. Hall realized this as soon as the question left his mouth, and Oprah realized it too. Oprah didn't respond immediately. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze sharp but not angry. She looked at Richard Hall as if she were evaluating someone who had just lost their entire strategy. "You're trying to hold on to something, aren't you, Mr. Hall?" The atmosphere in the studio had also shifted. When Richard Hall asked his first aggressive question, the audience was shocked. When he continued questioning whether Oprah was just a product of the times, people were uncomfortable. But when this question rang out, the one all successful people, especially those not from privileged classes, face, the audience was no longer convinced. They weren't just listening to Oprah. They were standing with her. She exhaled slowly, then looked straight at Richard Hall. "I know this question. I've heard it hundreds of times before, and I'll answer you simply." She gently folded her arms across her chest, her voice powerful. "If a rich, white man starts a company and makes billions, would anyone question whether he's really helped his community?" The studio went silent. This was no longer an interview. It was a lesson. Why is it that when a black person succeeds, the first question isn't about how hard they worked, but whether they're worthy enough? Why is their success always questioned? Why do they have to carry the extra burden of proving that they're not just working for themselves? She paused, letting her words sink into the atmosphere. Richard Hall shifted slightly in his chair, his hand gripping the armrest. A small gesture, but one that showed he was feeling threatened. But Oprah was not finished. She slowly raised her hand, as if counting off each point. I've given scholarships to thousands of black students, given them the opportunity to attend college when they never thought it was possible. Some of the audience nodded. I founded a school for girls in South Africa, where children who once thought they'd be stuck in poverty now dream of becoming doctors, teachers, scientists. Scattered applause began. I've donated millions of dollars to charities supporting homeless families, children without food, people forgotten by society. The applause grew louder. And most importantly, I've used my voice to uplift those who never had the chance to be heard. This time, the entire audience erupted into applause. Richard Hall said nothing. He knew he had nothing left to counter. He tried to maintain his confident appearance, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Because the truth was, he had lost. He had bet his entire credibility on cornering Oprah, but instead, he was the one who had been undeniably countered. He had misjudged her. Now, Richard Hall was no longer in control of the conversation. The audience no longer saw him as a sharp interviewer. They saw him as someone grasping at weak arguments. And Oprah? She didn't need to do anything more. She had won. She had done what few could, turned an attack into an inspiring moment. Richard Hall took a deep breath, knowing he could no longer continue down this path. He needed a new question, another way to regain control. But in this moment, there was an undeniable truth. This interview was no longer about criticizing Oprah Winfrey. It had become a testament to why she was respected by the world. Richard Hall sat motionless. He had just witnessed something he likely never encountered throughout his career. A person who not only successfully defends against sharp attacks, but also turns them into an opportunity to strengthen their position. But Richard couldn't stop. He had gone too far to back down. Trying to regain his confidence, he slowly took a deep breath, leaning forward as if to close the distance between himself and Oprah, searching for a weakness he could latch onto. So, can you say that you've truly helped the community? This time, his voice lacked its earlier sharpness. Oprah didn't respond immediately. She maintained her calm demeanor, but there was a sharpness in her gaze. She understood exactly what Richard Hall was trying to do. He no longer had enough reasoning to deny her success, so he was trying to distort it, turning it into something personal, a money grab race rather than a career with real meaning. But she wouldn't let him have that opportunity. She gently leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table, and spoke in a steady yet strong voice. Mr. Hall, I don't need to tell you what I have done, but I will, not to defend myself, but to affirm one thing. True success is not measured by numbers, but by the impact we leave behind. She paused briefly, then slowly raised one finger. I have awarded thousands of scholarships to underprivileged students, children who once thought they had no chance of escaping poverty. Richard Hall didn't say anything, but everyone could see his eyes flicker slightly. She raised a second finger. I built schools for poor children in South Africa, where hundreds of girls have been able to go to school, receive an education, dream, and become people who contribute to society. The atmosphere in the studio began to shift. The audience became more silent, not because they didn't care, but because they were truly listening. Oprah raised a third finger. I have created programs to support women and children around the world, giving them opportunities to work, learn, and change their lives. At this point, no one in the audience could stay still. The clapping began, initially scattered, but it gradually grew louder and stronger. But Oprah was not finished. She looked directly at Richard Hall, her gaze firm, and then spoke. Success is not just the money in your bank account, but the number of lives we can change. The studio erupted. The applause reverberated throughout the space, and this time no one stayed seated. Some in the audience stood up, cheering for her. Others even had tears in their eyes, because Oprah didn't just answer the question. She redefined the meaning of success. Richard Hall sat there, his hands clenched slightly, trying to maintain a neutral expression, but everyone could see it clearly. He had lost. All his attempts to corner Oprah, to diminish her value, to create a story he could control, every single one of them had failed. Because she didn't just respond, she turned his very questions into a lesson on rising above, on compassion, on the true influence of a person. And now, the eyes of the audience were no longer on Richard Hall. They were all looking at Oprah. She didn't need to say anything else, because she had said everything that needed to be said. And, more importantly, she had won. The applause had not yet fully subsided when Richard Hall shifted slightly in his chair. He didn't clap, nor did he smile. His face remained composed, but anyone with a keen eye could detect a change in his gaze. At the start of the interview, he was in control. He was confident, even somewhat arrogant. He believed he had the advantage, that Oprah was just a figure who could be subdued by sharp questions and clever attacks. But now, he wasn't so sure anymore. For the first time since the interview began, Richard Hall's hand gripped the armrest of his chair. A small gesture, but enough to show that he was seeking some sort of support. His voice, once sharp and full of challenge, had slowed down. Each time Oprah responded, he no longer immediately countered as he had before, because he realized he couldn't. She didn't shy away. She wasn't flustered. She didn't let herself be cornered. Instead, Oprah had turned the tables, using his own questions as opportunities to affirm her worth. And now, he recognized a truth. He had misjudged his opponent. Richard Hall remained seated, but now he no longer leaned back comfortably in his chair. Why was this happening? He asked himself. This wasn't the first time he'd conducted a difficult interview. Before Oprah, he had faced politicians, CEOs, even powerful figures in the financial world. But Oprah was different. She didn't play by his rules. She didn't let herself be manipulated by leading questions. She didn't react like someone being attacked. She reacted like someone guiding the conversation in her own way. And that left Richard Hall feeling out of control. Looking around the room, Richard could clearly see the audience's reactions. They were no longer drawn to his sharp questions. They weren't waiting for him to deliver provocative challenges, because now they were just listening to Oprah. She wasn't just answering questions. She was creating a story. She wasn't just defending herself. She was inspiring. A journalist like Richard Hall, with years of experience in the media industry, understood what this meant. He was losing. Not just losing in a simple debate, but losing in the battle for influence. For the first time throughout the entire interview, another question, not for Oprah, but for himself, entered his mind. Am I doing the right thing? It was a dangerous question, because throughout his career, Richard Hall had prided himself on being a sharp journalist, one who dared to ask tough questions, one who wasn't afraid to dig into sensitive topics. But now, facing Oprah, he realized there was a huge difference between asking tough questions to uncover the truth and asking tough questions simply to challenge someone. And he wasn't sure if he was still standing on the right side of that line. Richard Hall wasn't someone who easily admits defeat, but at this very moment, as he looked at Oprah, at the audience, at the way the interview was unfolding, he knew he had lost something crucial for a reporter: the control of the story. Now, he wasn't the one defining Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey was redefining him in front of millions of viewers. He could continue in the same manner, keep attacking, keep trying to twist the conversation to his will. But now, doing so would only make him look like a stubborn fool in his failure. Or he could change course, admit his mistake, and let the interview become a real moment of dialogue rather than a meaningless battle. Richard Hall took a deep breath. His hand was still gripping the armrest. He knew the next moment would decide everything. And for the first time in his entire journalistic career, he wasn't sure what to say next. Richard Hall took a deep breath, trying to adjust his posture as if he wanted to regain control of the conversation. He knew he was losing the upper hand, but a seasoned journalist like him wouldn't give up easily. "I need a decisive blow, a question that will throw her off balance." He looked at Oprah, his eyes flashing with a final glimmer of hope. "But do you think, without the media's favoritism, you could have achieved the success you have today?" The question was posed carefully, yet with an underlying intent to attack. Richard Hall hoped this time he would push Oprah onto the defensive, forcing her to admit that her success wasn't solely due to talent or personal effort. But as soon as the question was asked, Oprah gently smiled, a smile that was neither surprised nor flustered. It was as if she had been waiting for this question for a long time. Richard Hall felt an odd sense of unease. Typically, when a sharp question is posed, the other party takes a moment to think. They hesitate, weighing their words before responding. But Oprah didn't. She didn't waver. She didn't think for too long. Instead, she stared straight into his eyes, as if to tell him, "I knew you would ask this, and I already have my answer." That made Richard feel like he wasn't the one in control of the questions anymore. It was Oprah who was leading the conversation. She took a deep breath and slowly spoke. "The media can make someone famous, but it can't make someone succeed in the long run." She paused for a moment, letting her words linger in the air before continuing. "If it were only the media, I would have disappeared long ago." Some of the audience in the studio nodded slightly. They understood her point. The media can elevate someone's name, but if that person doesn't have the substance, the talent, they will be forgotten sooner or later. Oprah smiled, this time more sharply. How many people can you name who were once media sensations, but disappeared just a few years later? Her words cut through Richard Hall's arguments like a sharp knife, because it was an undeniable truth. In the entertainment world, the media can create a sensation, but if an individual doesn't have the ability to sustain their position, they will quickly be replaced. But Oprah hadn't just survived. She had become an icon. Richard Hall blinked, then quickly turned his face away, as if trying to think of a rebuttal. But this time, he couldn't come up with any reasonable argument to counter Oprah. He knew that. The audience knew that. Once again, Oprah hadn't just answered the question, she had turned the tables. She hadn't only proven that her success wasn't due to the media, but she had turned Richard's question into a self-contradiction. Because if the media could create an Oprah Winfrey, why hasn't there been a second Oprah? Why hasn't anyone been able to maintain the same influence she has had for over 40 years? That question was the final blow to Richard Hall's argument. The atmosphere in the studio changed dramatically. At first, many of the audience came to the interview just to see Oprah challenged, to watch her put into awkward situations. But now, they had forgotten their original purpose. They no longer cared whether Oprah could be taken down, because they were completely convinced. They no longer saw Oprah as a guest on Richard Hall's show. They saw her as the one leading the conversation. Now, Richard Hall had no choice but to face an undeniable truth. He couldn't attack Oprah anymore. Every sharp question of his had been perfectly deflected. He could keep trying, but if he did, he would only appear stubborn and completely defeated. Or he could choose a different path, to admit that Oprah was not someone easily beaten. Richard Hall looked down at his hands, then slowly looked up at Oprah. In that moment, he understood that he had to make a decision, and that decision would completely change the outcome of this interview. Richard Hall took a deep breath, his eyes showing a hint of confusion. He had tried every possible way. He had attempted to change the course of the conversation, trying everything to shake Oprah Winfrey's composure. But every time, she didn't just deflect his sharpest questions, she turned them into a perfect counterattack. He had lost. He knew that. But what confused him more was, he didn't feel angry. At first, Richard had walked into this interview with a strong belief that Oprah was just a product of her time, that she didn't truly deserve the fame she had. But now, looking at this woman, with her calmness, intellect, and unshakable strength, he began to realize that maybe he had misjudged her from the start. Oprah didn't rush to take advantage of Richard's silence to continue her attack. She didn't need to do that. She had already gained everything she needed. The truth had spoken for itself. But she also understood that this was the most important moment, the moment to end the debate in a way that no one could deny. She looked directly at Richard Hall, her gaze free of arrogance or reproach. It was simply the gaze of someone who knew her worth. She took a deep breath, then spoke, still calm, still steady, but carrying an undeniable strength. The media can make someone famous, but it cannot make someone truly successful. The entire studio went quiet. The only thing that has gotten me this far is myself, along with those who believe in me. As soon as those words ended, a round of applause erupted, louder than ever before. At first, it was just a few scattered claps, but then the entire audience stood up, cheering for Oprah. Some in the crowd exchanged looks as if they couldn't believe they had just witnessed something so remarkable. Oprah didn't just answer Richard Hall's questions. She redefined the entire interview. She didn't just defend herself. She inspired millions of people watching the broadcast. And that was what made Oprah Winfrey so special. Richard Hall sat there, silent before the audience's reaction. He had lost, but not in the way he had expected. This wasn't a bitter defeat, because right in this moment, he realized that he had witnessed something extraordinary. A part of him, the part of a true journalist, still hungry for the truth, felt a certain respect for Oprah. With no way out, no other choice, Richard Hall gently placed the pen on the table, looked up at Oprah, and slowly nodded. You've proven your point. There was no reluctance, no bitterness, just acceptance, and, perhaps, a change. Although the debate between Oprah and Richard Hall had ended, what Oprah said today would not just remain in the confines of the studio. The interview would quickly spread on social media. Oprah's words would become inspirational quotes. Those who had doubted her would have to rethink their perspective. And those who had ever felt they weren't good enough, not strong enough to chase their dreams, would have one more reason to keep going. Because as Oprah said, success has no skin color. It comes only to those who never stop striving and dare to dream big. Richard Hall, though not expecting it, had become part of a rare inspirational moment on television. Oprah, as she always did, didn't just answer. She changed the way people viewed success. And the world, after this interview, would never forget that moment. Just hours after the interview aired, social media exploded. Millions of people watched the clip and shared it with endless praise. Hashtags like Oprah wins, Mom Power of Wisdom, and Lessons from Oprah started trending on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, skyrocketing to the top overnight. No one could deny this. Oprah didn't just win a debate. She created a historic moment. Clips from the interview spread rapidly. Every sharp answer from Oprah, every intellectual counterattack, every moment she stayed calm under attack, all were widely shared. Everywhere, people were talking about how Oprah controlled the conversation, about how she not only defended herself, but turned an attack into an inspiring lesson. Major news outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, BBC, and CNN all published analyses of the interview. Some of the standout headlines: Oprah Winfrey, When Intelligence Triumphs Over Doubt, the New York Times. No one can defeat Oprah, and here's why, BBC News. Richard Hall learned a valuable lesson from Oprah Winfrey, Washington Post. Even influential figures couldn't ignore this moment. Michelle Obama, former First Lady of the United States, posted on Twitter, "A woman whose strength comes not just from what she has achieved, but from what she has overcome. Oprah Winfrey, you don't just inspire, you are proof of willpower and resilience." Respect. Actress Viola Davis, who has spoken about the challenges she faced in the entertainment industry, also expressed her admiration. "I've watched Oprah's interview 3 times. Every time I'd learn something new. This isn't just a debate. It's a lesson for all of us." Even those who had doubted Oprah before had to admit she did something few could do. She stood firm and changed how others viewed her in a direct confrontation. In the face of strong public support, Oprah gave an emotional speech at an event for young leaders. She stood on stage, looking out at a packed audience eagerly awaiting her words. "When I sat in that chair, facing a person who doubted me, I wasn't just answering for myself. I was answering for all those who've been doubted, undervalued, told they didn't deserve it." We don't need to prove our worth to those who don't believe in it. We just need to keep doing what we do best and let the truth speak for itself. Don't let anyone define you. Don't let anyone decide if you're worthy. Only you have the power to do that. The whole room stood up, applauding endlessly. That moment wasn't just Oprah's. It belonged to all those who have fought to prove their worth. The interview between Oprah and Richard Hall was no longer just a television event. It had become a symbol of perseverance, intellect, and courage. College students quoted Oprah's words in essays about success and social prejudice. Leaders used the interview as an example of how to face doubt without losing your essence. Some universities even incorporated this interview into their courses on media, psychology, and leadership. As for Richard Hall, he didn't disappear after the interview. But one thing was clear: he wasn't the same person as before. In a later interview, when asked about his feelings after the conversation with Oprah, Richard Hall simply said, "I went there looking for answers, but in the end, I learned something more important. Not everyone needs to prove their worth. Some people, like Oprah Winfrey, have proven it with their whole lives." A short statement, but one that carried all the respect he hadn't shown before. This story will be remembered for many years to come. Not because Oprah won a debate, but because she did something few could do: turn an attack into an inspiring moment. She didn't just defend herself. She redefined what success means. And when someone asks again, does Oprah Winfrey truly deserve her success? Millions of people around the world will have a simple answer. Watch that interview. All the answers are right there. The interview between Oprah Winfrey and Richard Hall wasn't just a televised showdown. It was a powerful testament to intelligence, courage, and perseverance. Despite being challenged with skeptical questions, Oprah never wavered. She not only defended her worth, but turned the attacks into an inspiring lesson for millions. And, more importantly, she made a man who once doubted her bow his head and admit the truth. What do you think about how Oprah handled this situation? If you were in a similar position, how would you respond? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other meaningful stories. Thank you for watching. See you in the next videos.